All right. So, hello everyone. So, the motion we're gonna do today is this house regrets the vilification of greed. I'm just gonna start the prep time immediately, and then we can just get right into it. So, I guess for this motion, it's quite important to acknowledge that, like, there are many reasons greed can be perceived to be bad, and there are many reasons greed can also be falsely perceived to be bad, right? And of course that the debate is not necessarily only about whether greed is good or bad, but it's about whether the manifestation of vilification in particular is productive or unproductive in the way we live our lives or for the way in which it affects people from this narrative, right? So immediately when I'm looking at this motion, one thing I would consider right at the beginning is to explain what does vilification look like. And I would say that vilification likely involves it's a stigma against individuals that are perceived to be greedy, which are like rich individuals, which include those who buy a lot of luxury items, and those who even out of a materialist concept are who are willing to do anything get to get one over another, or to outcompete against other individuals. So that's one. It's a social stigma against individuals that are perceived to be greedy. Vilification would also likely include like as a consequence of the stigma, it means that people um socially agree to shame on these particular individuals and to also blame them on the basis of their greed. And it also means that the vilification means that they are otherwise expected to not be greedy, which could mean that they should be unselfish. They should be they should be unselfish. They should be charitable. They should not brag about their wealth and the luxuries that they enjoy. All right, so that's perfectly fine. I think this is a fair explanation of what vilification looks like. Like if I were prime minister, I would be happy to say this. It's not necessary, but I think even for prep time purposes, like just agreeing that these are the concepts that are involved, that it's a stigma, right, and that it's a narrative that is socially agreed upon to shame on people. It involves a perception, and it's also one that encourages people to be unselfish and be charitable. So actually, I would say a few things then, right? I think hopefully, like even defining the act of defining what vilification is already allows us to make a couple of arguments that are inherently preemptive, in my opinion. The first argument that I would probably make, given this even this definition, right, is to explain, and I do want to be intentional with making this. Is I know that I want to make an argument that is about why the vilification is excessive, or why the vilification overcorrects itself, and it leads to more unhappiness from how people get happiness out of greed. So I would say that this vilification is disproportionate, and it discourages individuals from enjoying and being happy out of their material purchases or acts of greed. And here I would start off with a framing that I think is quite important to explain here. It's that, like, we live in a capitalist society, a capitalist or consumerist society, where on both sides of the house, it is likely that people will still be driven by money. People will still be driven by promotions and doing better at their job because they spend so much time at work over anything else. And I want to say that this preempts any opposition counterfactual, because even if they say that people are encouraged to be unselfish and to be more charitable, the way they live their life will never align with this, because they still compare themselves against other individuals on social media and otherwise. So you want to dispel the notion at opposition that opposition can live in like a completely like, you know, like let's say like a very religious and very quiet and stoic community that allows themselves to rid themselves from all these distractions, allows them to live without greed. But this greed is inherent to many individuals, for a vast majority of individuals, especially workers across all social classes. And this is a more universal feeling of dissatisfaction that they have all their lives. So if we can demonstrate that accessing greed allows for them to enjoy their efforts and work more, then the vilification does more harm than good, and it is quite unfair to a vast majority of people. All right, so now this is the part that's kind of easier to build in the argument. What does greed allow for? Right? Like, greed allows for them to have a center of self-worth that is always driven by acting in their own interest, right? Like being selfish is a good feeling in and of itself. Greed allows for them to always be seeking out and to be validated in purchasing things for themselves and not for others. And it also allows them to be more competitive in the workplace, in their educational setting, etc., etc. So already here we know that there's a lot of mechanisms to show why greed is great. It allows them to access this feeling of competitiveness, allows them to access that, like, hey, I definitely want to be better. I definitely want to get more. I definitely want to immerse myself more in this activity. So what is the whole point of this? The whole point of all of these mechanisms is that they immerse themselves in their greed, allows them to cope with the stresses of the workplace, and it allows them to enjoy the rewards of working hard. Whereas the counterfactual of opposition makes them, or the counterfactual opposition shames them for these actions, which they still would have been pressured into regardless. So this is where the fantastic framing comes in, right? We know that capitalist consumer society, they will be exposed to these pressures regardless because they compare themselves with other individuals. Now we're saying that greed is a great self-correcting mechanism. Greed allows them to immerse in their hard work, immerse in enjoying like the stuff that they own for themselves. They work hard on their own, and that is fantastic for a vast majority of people. And actually, you would even argue, like you can even add to the argument later on, and we might want to add to this argument, that this narrative is simply unfairly imposed on a lot of people who simply want to enjoy being greedy for once in their life. Like, this isn't really necessarily a debate about like we all hate the rich, Because even middle class, lower class people can have moments of greed that they are also otherwise shamed for. And because you'd want to say that this narrative is controlled by a lot of people that are relatively more privileged than not, then that is where it becomes more unfair to a vast majority of people, right? So this is a fantastic individual argument for work. It's a fantastic individual argument for the lifestyle that they may have. So, here's where we want to add a preemption here, right? A very important preemption. Opposition may say that greed is quite expensive, and it makes people lose a lot of money, right? And I think that's an okay argument on opposition. Actually, a great argument to say that like even lower class, middle class people just lose a lot more money because they're expected to be greedy, right? They're allowed to indulge in their greed, right? And I think that the simple response against this is to say that greed is greed even if it is expensive, is its own happiness that people can never and should never take away from them, or should never, yeah, it's not how people can never and should never take away from them. Yeah, that's fantastic. I think it's quite important to explain that like this is its own happiness, this is its own value. People cannot take away from that. And the way they spend their own money, it's their own ownership over it. The control that they have, the meaning that they get from this greed in and of itself is a good value that we must celebrate. So that's the first argument. You could add a lot more to this. We already know that that's the base important things that we wanted to say. The most important part of the argument was really just the framing that we wanted to say at the very beginning. The other part of the definition of vilification that is quite important for us to address is that it's also a debate on like perception. It's also a debate on like blame. It's also a debate on like who we assign for fault of this. And here we would say that the vilification targets minorities more than it does privileged individuals, which actually it adds some layer of proof to the first argument, but it's not really necessary for the first argument, right? Like we said, the first argument applies to all people because they're shamed and whatever for their things that they enjoy. But the second argument really hammers on this down because opposition may make the argument that says that the hate against the rich and the hate against greed allows them to lobby for more fair policies on the distribution of income, and it allows for a greater access for it allows for a greater access for social welfare, right? Because of this redistribution that they would otherwise fight for. And they might even add the argument like, this it's based on critical mass, it's based on combating privilege and acknowledging this, etc., etc. But the fault of this argument is simply that it assumes that this vilification always targets the rich alone and that they can change their behavior. But this is relatively unlikely because they can choose their social spaces, they are immune to criticism for a lot of reasons, and they're simply too powerful and entrenched in lobbying systems such that this vilification is likely not destroying their wealth entirely. So we've already dispelled like what the aspirational argument of opposition, right? They can make it a more realistic argument later on, but we've dispelled the most like ambitious argument of opposition. Instead, now our best way to approach this is to now make an argument that goes like, okay, instead it targets people who are easy to shame for being greedy, and this is definitely like those who are younger and are earning their place above those who are older, and those who are yeah, and sorry, and even women, and even women in the workplace who are not expected to be as ambitious. So here we've said that, like, now the vilification of greed amplifies other discriminatory narratives like the patriarchy, like ageism, etc. So here we've already made a fantastic argument that says that vilification amplifies this discriminatory narrative. It actually doesn't help those who are minorities. It actually worsens and targets them a lot more, even for the benefit of the rich, because they're the ones who control the narrative, and also they're gonna be immune to the criticism regardless. And so even if the criticism exists, those who are shamed the most and are easier to shame and also scapegoat for the as a consequence of greed, because they're also visible for this, because they speak more in the workplace, because they're trying to be more confident, because they're bragging on social media. These are people that are affected the most. So they become more unhappy. They become more discouraged, and they are targeted more. All right, so this is a great argument. I think this is a fantastic one. I just wanted to say at the end of this prep time, we've addressed what vilification looks like. We've created some arguments on how it's disproportionate, how it is, it applies to all workforces and the individual layer. And then we also have a social argument which addresses the social arguments of opposition. We preempt this a lot, and we also explain how this is going to be worse for a lot of other people too. All right, fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Hopefully you learned from this prep time that, making an argument always starts from the definition in this sense, making it clear what that counterfactual look like, and then addressing all the different concerns of opposition too. All right, see you guys.